Good morning. Welcome. And we're so happy to see everyone here this morning and welcome Dr. Sarah Eckhart. So thank you, Sarah, for doing this twice. It's a lot of fun to see it in the galleries, and thank you for joining us from afar. So today's talk is 3:30 is Minimalism with Dr. Sarah Eckhart, our Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art. And she's going to explore the form of an abstract art that was developed in the US in the 1960s. And I'm going to just turn it right over to Sarah this morning and let her talk about minimalism. Sorry, it's hard for me to say that three times.
That's fine. Thank you so much, Lulan. So I am coming to you from New York, ironically. Although this is a gallery tour and I was in the gallery on Tuesday, I am in a hotel room in New York City this Thursday, which is one of the things that makes Zoom amazing, that we can do this from anywhere. I'm going to share my screen. I hope everybody can see this and this it's full screen and looks good on your end. It looks good on my side. So when I gave this tour on Tuesday morning, I actually had to stop first in the Abstract Expressionist Gallery because I think it is very difficult to understand minimalism as a movement that emerged in the 1960s if you don't first understand Abstract Expressionism as a movement in the late 1940s, mid 1940s through the mid 1950s. And so Abstract Expressionism, much like minimalism, actually was a radical movement for its time. It was something a lot of people had difficulty understanding. So I'm just going to give you a 2-minute overview of Abstract Expressionism before we transition into thinking about what minimalism was. So with Abstract Expressionism, you have this language that emerges from a group of artists in New York City in the 1940s who were in the midst of World War II, experiencing all of the violence and the migration and all of, the world turned upside down in the mid 1940s through World War II. And so you had artists who were really responding to this as these European artists, because of World War II, were refugees and were leaving what had been the center of the art world, Paris and Europe more largely, and moving into New York City, where then there was this mix, and you had some techniques of surrealism emerging in Abstract Expressionism. And gesture becomes one of the key elements, and the hand. And I chose this work to talk about Abstract Expressionism because the handprint is so evident. That's of course not Willem de Kooning's handprint, that's his daughter's, Lisbeth's handprint. And we're actually going to end by talking about a minimalist piece dedicated to a different artist daughter, named for a different artist daughter. So it's also kind of a nice beginning and end. We have here Lisbeth's handprints in Willem de Kooning's painting. But one of the ideas for the Abstract Expressionists that was so important to them was their own hand. It was they were making these gestures. As they made these gestures, they were expressing some sense of self. And believe it or not, even though a lot of people may not understand Abstract Expressionism, one of the sincere goals of many of the Abstract Expressionists was they wanted to come up with some sort of universal language, because of all these cultural differences, they're very much front of mind for them. They were thinking, a gesture, abstraction, it gets away from what a particular landscape from a particular place or country might mean. Instead, they're communicating emotion they felt more directly. So all of that is to give you this sense of what Abstract Expressionism was. It emerges, and while it's sort of radical in the late 40s and early 50s, by the late 50s, when a new generation of students are going to art school, and in fact, art schools are becoming much more professionalized, this becomes sort of the ubiquitous language. So you have all of these artists whose teachers paint in a very abstract expressionist style. And once you reach that kind of saturation point, I think frequently you have another generation that is looking for something different. They're pushing back on those ideas and they're thinking very differently. enter minimalism. So in our minimalist gallery, our first stop on the 3 and 30 gallery tour was Donald Judd's meter boxes. And that's for several reasons. One, I think Donald Judd's name is just absolutely connected to minimalism. And two, he really became something of a spokesperson for minimalism. And one of the things that I find amusing, I guess, about minimalism is while these objects are incredibly pared down and simple objects, the artists themselves, especially Donald Judd, wrote pages and pages about what these objects were and what this movement was about. So Donald Judd coined the term specific object in 1963, I believe, mid-1960s. And he was writing essays in Art Forum, and there was a real back and forth. And it was really kind of one of the main principles was this idea that the object was itself and nothing more. So where the abstract expressionists thought about mythology and were influenced by Jung, and there was a sort of whole idea of emotional kind of this sort of sense of direct expression from the artist, but using these ideas of sort of universal myths. All that's out with minimalism. And what Donald Judd and other artists were thinking about were the materials themselves, the specificity of the object, and the total lack of the artist's hand. So in this case, Donald Judd started off by building boxes, painting them red, and showing them in the kind of the white cube New York gallery kind of setting. And then he actually began deciding to work on making much more finished and simple objects, industrial objects. And he actually started calling in, it was so important to him that he be distant from these objects that he would call in the specs for the boxes that he wanted made with this high degree of polish and with as little evidence of the artist's hand as possible. And so you have these meter boxes, and he continues to make these series then for many years forward. So while he started those in the 1960s, these are made, as you can see, in 1983, but they're very much of a series with these earlier pieces. And he was interested in seriality, the spaces in between the boxes, that the number of inches is just as important as the object itself. And then the sort of variations that he plays with then with color. So, you know, those are sort of the basics of minimalism. But one of the reasons that I was asked why Izzy asked me to give this talk was because I was so excited. It was back in February during the African American Read-In. I was so excited about the Minimalism Gallery, not actually because of Donald Judd's work, but because of some of the interventions that Valerie Cassell Oliver started making in the Minimalism Gallery and the conversations that she opened up. So today, rather than 3 objects, the de Kooning didn't count as an object, that was background. I'm playing with the 3 and 30. It's 3 pairings in 30 minutes. I'm gonna check my time. So I'm just gonna give about 5 minutes per pairing. So the first pairing was the Donald Judd with this Jenny C. Jones work, which, as you can see, was made in 2014. And Jenny C. Jones is yet another generation moving forward. So we had the abstract expressionist generation, we had the minimalist generation about 20 years later, and now we move forward 40, 50 years, and we have Jenny C. Jones working in the 21st century and looking back and thinking about the minimalists, but again, doing something different, thinking differently about it. So this is what you're looking at are 2 pieces. They, like the minimalists, are made of speaker, that is the fabric that goes over speakers, because she thinks a lot about music and sound as well as painting and sculpture and objects. And then what you lose in this object, and what I strongly encourage you to go look at in the gallery, is this red glow that usually comes from the side here. I'm pointing at my screen, realizing you can't see it. That comes from the side of this panel and from the top of the panel. And that's because she's painted a bright red strip. that's sort of hidden when you're looking front on, but from the side you can see this red strip that then glows, kind of makes an echo, to use a sound term, on the wall. And then what I don't have for you here, but if you stand in front of this work again in the Minimalist Gallery, you will hear a sound element. And there's a speaker, and what you hear is the dropping of a needle onto a record, and the first note, and then a lifting, and then a quiet space, and then a dropping of the needle again, a different note, and a picking up. And it's a recording of the beginnings, the first note of different records, and you get this space in between. And so there's this sound element paired with this object, this painting. Well, I'm not exactly sure what we could. It's not exactly it is a painting and it's a sculpture at the same time. And in both cases, she was thinking very specifically about the late 1960s, and she was thinking about minimalism, and she was thinking about avant-garde jazz. And she was thinking about who was not involved in those things, namely women artists. Very few women artists are part of the conversation around minimalism. And that was something that the feminists at the time, especially as feminism was emerging at that time, pointed out. It was a very masculinist language around minimalism. And then she was also thinking about the fact that there were very few women involved in avant-garde jazz as well. So as a Black woman working in the 21st century as an artist, she is thinking about the spaces where women were excluded specifically. And so the spaces in her own work are very much a commentary on this idea of who's missing, at looking at the space in between the sound, the silence between the dropping of the notes and the space between these panels. Are for her a commentary on this work that came before, that she's very interested in and in conversation with, but also realizes that she could not have made a place at that time in those movements, or it would have been very difficult to make a place in those movements at that time. Also, one other thing about this space, she's also thinking about Barnett Newman, the artist, abstract expressionist artist, who was very important to the minimalists with the zips that he would put in his paintings. Okay, second pairing, I'm watching my time. This is Ellsworth Kelly's 4 panels, green, black, red, blue of 1966. And a question came up about the definition of minimalism. And I should point out that, like every movement, not every artist agrees with the title. Not every artist even thinks minimalism applies to them, even though they get put in certain categories. So Ellsworth Kelly would not actually think of himself as a minimalist in quite the same way, in that his work actually is very based in his observations of nature. More difficult to tell when you're looking at this work, 4 panels, but there are other objects you may have seen by Ellsworth Kelly where there's a rounded edge, or they can be a little bit more, they're still very geometric, but they can be a little bit more organic with their curves as shaped canvases. He's looking at nature, he'll look at the space between trees or different elements, and he tries to reduce them into their most simplified form. So you have here these 4 panels. Quick note, if you were to flip them around and look on the back, he actually changed his mind about the order green, black, red, blue several times before landing on green, black, red, blue. You can see the colors crossed out as he rewrites their order. That's just a behind the scenes thing you wouldn't know from looking at the object, but that we think about. And then also the installation, his spacing, whereas for Donald Judd, you have to have an exact amount of space between his meter boxes. Here, Ellsworth Kelly left us our own decision. We can place these panels anywhere from 2 to 10 inches apart, depending on the size of the wall that they're on and what they're near. We went with 6 this time. But again, things that you find on the back of a written directions from artists on the back that you wouldn't know. And so I think Valerie rather brilliantly paired Ellsworth Kelly's work with Ruth Kennedy's work, Blocks and Strips, a quilt. And Ruth Kennedy is a Gee's Bend quilter in an area now called Boykin, Alabama. It's very isolated by a river on 3 sides, so it's difficult to get to. And Ruth Kennedy actually was within 3 years of the same age as Ellsworth Kelly. So this would have been, they were both born in the 1920s. And one of the things that's really interesting one of the reasons it's interesting to put them in conversation, even though geographically and culturally they are so far apart, is that Ruth Kennedy talks very much in a similar way about how she arrives at her patterns. So on the one hand, Geesben quilters, this is a skill that is passed down from generation to generation through families. They're made in community, and some of the patterns are more or less set, and yet each artist makes their own variations on these patterns and also has their own visions. So Ruth Kennedy decides what she wants to look like, what she's and how she's going to see it. She pieces it and the top together, and then as a community, a group of artists or a group of women and artists sew the quilt together. So the working process, obviously, then very different from the way that Ellsworth Kelly is still talking in a much more individualistic way about his own process. But Ruth Kennedy talks about looking at nature and looking at the world around her to gain inspiration for her patterns. And so she's looking at the colors around her as she decides what she's going to use. So it's not a dissimilar process between Ellsworth Kelly and Ruth Kennedy. And then another comparison or thing to think about with Donald Judd calling in his specs, this idea of industry, of he wants his work to look as if it was made in a factory or was made industrially. One of the reasons Ruth Kennedy is working in corduroy is because the Geesben quilters had an arrangement. They had a collective and they worked for Sears Roebuck in sewing out of corduroy bed covers and pillow shams. And part of the deal was that they were allowed to take the scraps home. And so they were using corduroy in a lot of their quilts from the 1970s forward because of this relationship. So also this idea of, or at least I find interesting, this idea that Donald Judd wanted something to look industrial, and you have Ruth Kennedy making something from the scraps of working in a factory, or not exactly a factory, but working for a large company mass producing something, and then she's making this out of the scraps. So there's sort of an inverse relationship there. And my final, we're doing pretty well on time. My final pairing then is Saul Lewitt. This is his 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 from 1978. But he similarly was working in the 60s. So just as our work by Donald Judd is 83, but it's very much in conversation with what he was doing in the 60s. It's similar with Saul Lewitt. So Saul Lewitt makes break, in a sense, from minimalism towards conceptualism in the 1960s. And as Donald Judd is calling in these specs for his objects that are made, Saul Lewitt also decides that his hand, his making the object, is not as important as his idea for the object. So he doesn't need his objects to be made industrially, but he decides that the plan, that the instructions or the idea that generates the object is more important than the object itself. And so here you have a kind of a math formula that generates a sculpture. If you rounded the corner, and I apologize, I forgot to put a slide of this in, but if you rounded the corner from the Minimalism gallery, you would see his wall murals. And those beautiful wall murals, we could tear those out and it would not be a problem, because we have the sheets, the instructions from Saul Lewitt for how to paint them, for what they should look like, and for the idea that kind of generates the work, the object. And so Saul Lewitt is very much then associated with conceptualism. And I paired that piece because, again, Valerie, I think, made this beautiful addition to the Minimalism gallery by adding Melvin Edwards' Anna's Corner. So Mel Edwards was born in Houston. He then trained in Los Angeles and was working kind of in the LA scene before, in the late 60s, he moves to New York City. And he went from having worked in more of a assemblage technique in Los Angeles, and you would have seen one of his pieces called Hers in Dirty South if you visited the Dirty South exhibition, where he was welding pieces together to primarily make wall hanging pieces. Here he enters into this conversation with minimalism and conceptualism with Anna's Corner. So he was making drawings in space with this barbed wire. But similar to Saul Lewitt, what we have from Mel Edwards is a very basic kind of schematic for what this should look like, how far apart each of the eyelets should be in the wall. And then we produce Anna's Corner ourselves. So one of the more amusing parts of this installation, at least I thought, was when the art handlers rolled in the cart for the installation. There was a piece of paper that said art beneath, which is what we usually put that piece of paper on top of drawings, say, if we have them out as we're sorting drawings, so that everybody knows that to protect the art that is underneath. And when you lift the art underneath sign off it was just a coil of barbed wire. So we purchased the barbed wire to his specifications, and then the art handlers installed these all the way up the wall at different points. And this work was shown in Melvin Edwards' solo show at the Whitney Museum in 1971. And it's interesting because it is very much in conversation, and yet the introduction of barbed wire adds some narrative to it. Why is he using barbed wire? What does this mean? And having grown up in Houston, I think it was a material he saw a lot, but it also can have several different references. And he dedicated this to his daughter, Anna, who actually lives, you may know Anna Edwards, in Richmond, Virginia. She's a wonderful activist, historian, and she has done a lot to have historical markers put up acknowledging important African-American sites throughout Richmond. So at any rate, in 1970, they were living apart. She was still in Los Angeles while he was in New York City. And so while the barbed wire can look, I think as Valerie termed it, punitive, it was not meant to convey that. In fact, it was actually more about protection, making something that was protective. But you can see the ways in which he's introducing a little bit of narrative into this otherwise minimal and conceptual conversation. And I'm gonna switch slides. Oh, here's a detail so that you can see the barbed wire up close. And I want to close on an object that is not part of the 3 and 30, but we ended our tour by walking out through a new installation we have in the, I'm trying to describe, we used to call it the 1990s gallery. If you make that U shape and you're walking out towards the bridge over to 21st century, we have a whole set of paintings of artists, again, in the same way minimalism responded to abstract expressionism, a group of artists responding to minimalism in a movement called pattern and decoration. So this is a work by Cynthia Carlson in our collection from 1974, part of the pattern and decoration movement, in which a number of women were thinking, again, about these spaces where they have been left out, spaces where it's very hard to get representation as a woman artist in the New York galleries at that time as well. And intentionally taking women's work and patterns, things that could be found in domestic spaces, and putting them at the forefront in the subject of their paintings, but also still thinking about the idea, like with Donald Judd, repetition, thinking about pattern itself. So you can see here Cynthia Carlson's use of a kind of series of stripes, and yet this return to the hand, the return to gesture, so much so, again, with reference to the domestic, she used cake decorating tools to actually squeeze the paint out. So it's very visible. The marks are very visible and three-dimensional on the surface. So you have this sense of women's labor and women's work also kind of highlighted in these objects that take domestic conversations like wallpaper and make them at the forefront of the object. So that's where I'm going to close. Lulan, I don't know if we have questions that have come in. I'm going to stop share. And
Thank you, Sarah.
oh, say more about pattern and decoration. Never heard of it. Yes, I had never heard of it either. I'm going to let you know. We had a wonderful visit from a curator. This is exactly the way I love art history to work, and exactly the way I really appreciate kind of a whole generation now of curators. I would say junior, but maybe not so junior anymore. We had a curator named Anna Katz come from LA MoCA, and she requested to see a number of paintings in storage, a number of them from the Sidney and Francis Lewis collection. And they were objects that have not been on view since the 70s or the 80s. And so it was a revelation for Valerie and me. We were in storage and we start pulling out these paintings, and then she starts explaining to us, also that, the colors, so it's like pink and purple, they're not the colors that we think of. We started thinking and talking about how trained we have been by minimalism and by its prominence in our art historical training. Even our color palette and what we're looking for in a painting from a certain era has been very trained. And that was exactly what these, not just women and men, but it was very clearly a feminist movement, pattern and decoration. This is what these artists were pushing against, was just how almost oppressive the language of minimalism had become in the art world, in the same way that abstract expressionism became so dominant, then minimalism becomes so dominant. But what was fascinating to me is that pattern and decoration had really been lost, at least to me, in my own art historical training. In my master's and PhD coursework, never came up. And it was a pretty cohesive group of artists for about 10 years who weren't a collective, but they strategized, they had group shows together. So because Anna Katz did this show for LA MoCA called Pattern and Decoration and produced a wonderful catalog full of research, statements written by the artists, Valerie and I decided that we would do a gallery dedicated to pattern and decoration and pull out the works from the Sidney and Francis Lewis collection that had been part of pattern and decoration. So there's that. Okay, next person says, great if some conceptualism could be done in the future. Yes, so one of the things that is clearly lacking from our collection, we've got great strengths in pop art, great strengths in a number of areas. We have very little conceptual art. And so that is something Valerie and I think about often. It's a specialty of Valerie's because she does a lot of conceptual, she's done whole shows. Double Consciousness, I'm thinking of a number of shows she's done around conceptualism. It just involves kind of finding ways to find objects that make sense in conversation with the objects that we already have. So that is definitely a part of our vision, thinking about the collection holistically going forward. Let's see, should we get any other? Oh, three questions. Oh, why do you think it's called Horseman? I have no idea, but Cynthia Carlson wrote me out of the blue. Did not know we had just put her paintings on view at all. And wrote because she needed a credit line for what turned out to be a exhibition she had at a pattern and decoration exhibition we had at VMFA in 1980. And she did her wall, she did, now I'm going over 30 minutes. She did patterns with that cake decorating, the sort of she would squeeze out the paint. She would cover entire walls making just making wallpaper, but also calling attention to sort of women's work. I had written in the wall label that she did one of these shows here in New York City. That was a big deal. But she actually did it at VMFA in the old ICA at VMFA, and she sent us the photos, and we had our own pattern and decoration show in 1980 for like 6 weeks. So all that to say, I can ask her why she titled it Horseman. I have no idea.
And I know, Sarah, we're getting close on time. Someone wanted to see that last painting, and then there's one more question about artist, and there's someone who asked about artist intentions, such as Jazz note, it's not self-evident, and how do artists expect viewers to understand these intentions? That's a big question. So I don't know if we want to. If we have time to answer that one, but
yeah, I am not sure. I'm going to share the screen really quick so I can show that last painting, and I'll try to. There we go. I'm assuming this is the last painting. This is the Cynthia Carlson Horseman. That was the work they were asking about. Yeah, artist intention, that's a big one. And there are a lot of different artists with a lot of different philosophies about how to do that. Some artists, like Donald Judd, wrote extensively, and he would have wanted you to just enter into that dialogue, take the time to read his entire essays in Art Forum to understand the object. That's can be when people start to feel that work is rather exclusive. Other artists don't feel like you need to know, that you just experience it and you have the experience that you have based on it. Artists are kind of all over the map, I think, on how they feel. Some artists don't want you ever to know their intention. It doesn't matter to them. Their intention doesn't matter. Your understanding their intention doesn't matter. Other artists, are very clear in explaining their intentions. So that's a big question, but my quick answer at the end is it's sort of all over the map.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. That was really great. And for everyone who is able to come and see these pairings, just in the Minimalist Gallery, it's wonderful to see them together if you're able to. It looks great.
And yeah, and my final thing is just that I'm so grateful for Valerie's vision. That was the reason we did this 3 and 30, was just to sort of show off the ways in which she's opening up conversations in the gallery. So she was there at the tour in person, and I thanked her there. So I'll end by thanking Valerie for her wonderful vision that is making all of these spaces for conversation in our galleries. All right.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody. Bye.